Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's July 30th, 2025, and today we have a very special rebroadcast of a Mormon Stories classic. And let me just give you a little background. So when I was at Brigham Young University back from 1987 to 1993, there was a really important magazine called Sunstone Magazine that covered Mormon history, Mormon news, Mormon current events, Mormon culture, Mormon art, etc. And it was for sure one of the most influential things in my life at the time. It's where I learned about the Paul H. Dunn scandal. It's where I learned about the baseball baptisms. It's where I learned about the George P. Lee scandal. It's where I learned about the September 6th. And Sunstone Magazine at its peak had over 10,000 subscribers. And before the internet, it was for sure the way that people found friends and community and support for a Mormon faith crisis. So this year, August of 2025, Sunstone is celebrating its 50th anniversary. And so I'll be speaking at the Sunstone Symposium in a couple days on, reflecting on the Mormon internet over the past 25 years, but also just, this is a time for us to celebrate Sunstone and its importance and its history. So back in 2007, I interviewed Elbert Peck, and Elbert Peck was the editor of Sunstone Magazine from 1986 to 2001, probably one of the longest serving editors of Sunstone Magazine, if not the longest serving editor of Sunstone. Sunstone was started by a couple people whose names you've probably never heard of, Scott Kinney and someone else. Then Peggy Fletcher Stack took Sunstone over and for several years ran both the magazine and the symposium until she left to go work for the Salt Lake Tribune. And then Elbert took it over, and sort of 1986 to 2001 was, I would say, the most influential, the most successful, the most powerful time of Sunstone. Sunstone was so powerful that Dallin H. Oaks issued a statement condemning it. But obviously 1993 was the year I graduated from BYU. It was also the year of the September 6th. So Sunstone's super important. There wouldn't be a Mormon Stories without Sunstone. Elbert Peck is one of the most lovely and thoughtful and intellectual people you'll ever hear from. This interview has only gotten a few thousand views because it was released so long ago. And then also we chopped it up into 3 or 4 parts. And, that doesn't make sense. We did that back in the day where iPods had a minimum capacity. So what we've done is we've remastered the audio. We've brought the 4 parts together as a single episode, and we're re-releasing it in 2025 because we think you'll really value the history, but also because we want you to all know about the importance Sunstone Magazine and the Sunstone Symposium are for the world. So what you're going to see is Elbert Peck, a giant in the history of Mormon studies, of Mormon thought, of Mormon publishing, of Mormon Symposium. And you're going to hear the story of kind of the rise and fall of Sunstone Magazine. Sunstone Magazine no longer publishes. They may still do some online stuff, but really the only main remnant of Sunstone these days is the Sunstone Symposium. That's really important. So if you watch this before, Friday or Saturday, come to Sunstone. You can meet me. You can hear my talk. There's other great, fantastic people who come to Sunstone. It's like Mormon Comic-Con. And, Sunstone hopefully will be around for a long, long, long time. So support Sunstone. But most importantly, I hope you enjoy this historic interview of me interviewing Elbert Peck. And just know the audio's not good. The color's not good. This was back when I didn't know anything about audio or video, but I still think it's a historic, important interview. So check it out. Check out Sunstone. And please give me your feedback. Let me know if you enjoyed these classic episodes. If you want to see us do more, please comment on how you liked Elbert, what you thought about it, if you have questions about it. And I'd love your feedback. Email us at mormonstories@gmail.com or comment on Spotify or on YouTube. Subscribe and like the channel. Thanks for the donors that make all this possible. And now please enjoy my interview from 2007, I believe, with Elbert Peck, former editor of Sunstone Magazine and former director of the Sunstone Education Foundation. Tell us your name.
Elbert Eugene Peck.
Elbert Eugene Peck.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about your childhood growing up and your early years in the church that led to your interest in Sunstone?
Well, I was born in Utah, but I spent my junior high and high school years in suburban Washington, D.C., which had a big influence on me. Particularly, I got, it awakened me intellectually and socially, particularly in my government and civics classes. So I saw Thomas Jefferson and people like that. And so I sort of became a child of the Enlightenment and believed in pursuing truth wherever it went. And I guess I was later influenced by the Vietnam War and Watergate, events like that. I went to BYU, so I don't know how far you want me to go.
Yeah, that's good. In your early years, let's say high school, early college, the faith or the testimony that you had, where was it rooted? Was it rooted in spiritual experience? Was it rooted in sort of intellectual conviction? Was it rooted in just the culture and the heritage that you brought with you? You know, the early testimony that you remember having, how was it composed or structured?
I think primarily it was fundamentally social. I grew up in great wards with great mentors and scoutmasters, and I loved that community, and I loved the people, and I thought the church was true. Although I had, I guess, in my teenage years, a lot of cultivated spiritual experiences, like youth conferences and taking family group trips to church history sites in New York and places where we'd have little family group testimony meetings with about 8 different families, and those were all formative. So by the time I ended my teenage years, I knew the church was true, and I think I had a better than average understanding of the doctrines. I remember thinking at one point that I knew everything about the church, and it was logically consistent. I wouldn't say I was an intellectual then, but I was intellectually curious. And when I hit BYU, I liked thoughtful presentations. I sort of fell in love with Hugh Nibley, and I really liked the exploration of Mormon history and Mormon studies, because it was just a learning more about how God works among our people and celebrating that. So by the time I went on my mission in the mid-70s, I discovered BYU Studies and even subscribed to that while I was a missionary, which was like, I was the only person on my mission who really read that sort of stuff.
Where'd you serve?
California, Nevada.
Which, just out of curiosity, which ward did you grow up in the D.C. area?
The McLean ward and then the Vienna ward.
So Virginia.
In Virginia,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. So how was your mission? What was your mission like?
I guess I actually had 2 missions, because I had a change of mission presidents and a change of mission boundaries halfway through my mission. That gave me 2 missions and 2 mission presidents. And it was a great experience. The first one was very strict and rule-bound, and I bristled under that. But I fell in love with the work and the people, and it was a great ocean of spirituality for me. And the second part, the new mission president kind of liked me. I was on a fast track of leadership, and I fell in love with the missionaries and moving the work of the mission, and that was a great experience. I have no complaints about my mission.
After your mission, did you return to BYU?
Went back to BYU, took a bunch of honors classes, and that kind of piqued me intellectually, and ran into some friends who wanted to form a study group to study Mormon things, which interested me very much. And members of that group were Gary Bergera and Ron Prittis, Scott Dunn, and each time we met, people would have to make a presentation. We'd all rotate that, and Gary would read a paper that he was going to present at the Mormon History Association or Sunstone. We went as a group to my very first Sunstone meeting, and it was the second symposium ever held. And
what year was that?
I was
or era, late 70s, early 80s?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the first symposium was like 79, I think, so this may have been 1980. Okay. I remember someone pointing across this was at the University of Utah, pointing across a plaza and saying, "That's Peggy Fletcher. She's the person who organized it." And like, I was, wow, she's a big person. And later, a lot of members of that little group I belonged to started an independent newspaper at BYU called the Seventh East Press. And I was the first editor of that newspaper. And that was a sensation at BYU. We dealt with lots of intellectual issues. Gary Bergera wrote a theology column for the newspaper, and I met a lot of BYU faculty and became more close to them than I ever did as a student.
Who are some of these faculty at BYU that you met and you're close with?
That I got to know there.
Yeah.
People like Arthur Bassett, even Don Norton, a very conservative person in the English department. It's where I first really met face-to-face Hugh Nibley. Who else did I meet there? Once a week, or whenever we came out with a paper, we meant to be weekly, but we never were. I'd take a stack of them and go and deliver them to faculty's offices, and they all say, come in, and sit me down and talk to me. Jim Faulkner would do that. In political science, Lou Midgley would do that. A lot of these were very conservative people, but they celebrated the idea of a vibrant intellectual forum on campus run by students. And who else? Got to know Maren Morrison and the student, she ran the student programs for the university. Probably dozens of faculty. In the German department, got to know Alan Keel, Scott Abbott. I don't think Scott was there yet. I got to know him later. It's where I first met Eugene England.
Ted Lyon?
No, I didn't know Ted Lyon.
Okay. So BYU professors were actually, there was a number of them excited about the Seventh East Press.
They were ecstatic about it, more so than the students were. I think the reverse was true with the paper that succeeded that, the Student Review, but here the faculty were just thrilled about it and encouraged us on in doing the Seventh East Press.
And how many years did that go on while you were there, the Seventh East Press?
I ran that for one full school year. And it was a traumatic thing. We lived in an apartment building. In the front room was the office of Student Review, so it was like 24 hours, and it was kind of sort of burning me out. But in the process of doing that, Peggy Fletcher, who was always looking for help at Sunstone, came down and kind of invited us up and met us, and we ran an interview with her in the newspaper. And then she recruited me to come and work for her. So I left the Seventh East Press and went and worked for Peggy. She was having a second publication by Sunstone called the Sunstone Review, which was a combination book review and a news magazine, Mormon news magazine. She hired me to be the managing editor of it. So for another year, I was managing editor of that under Peggy Fletcher, and we ran a symposium in the summer. I was involved in that and wrote my first editorial for the Sunstone Magazine, and was kind of tutored and mentored and became very good friends with Peggy in that process. And so that's how I ended up in Sunstone. I left doing Student Review and moved back to Washington, and where my family was still, and got a job there. I'd come out in the summers for the symposium, and I was listed in the masthead as a national correspondent. And once driving home from a symposium, this was like in 85, I guess. Yes. No, 84. Jay Bybee and I were driving home from a symposium across the country, taking my brother's car home, and we were talking about how great the symposium was and how nice it would be to have one in Washington, D.C. So he was a columnist for Sunstone, and I'd worked for Peggy, and so we called her, and she gave us permission to organize what was the first regional Sunstone Symposium in Washington, D.C. And that was really a great event. We, three of us, Jay and I and a woman named Allison Bethke, met each week and came up with our dream team of who we want to speak, and found out all the Mormon intellectuals in Washington, and there were quite a few because Mary Bradford had run Dialogue from Washington, so she had quite a network that we hooked into, as well as a lot of other people. And the three people we wanted to have were like Hugh Nibley and Jan Ships and Leonard Arrington, like the three big names back in the mid-'80s. And they all came. And we had 600 people there, and it was a wonderful event. And I planned it the next year. And by the time the one happened in the next year, I I'd agreed to come to Sunstone.
As a full-time editor? Or
Yeah.
As a full-time employee?
No, full-time editor. Peggy had gotten married in the meantime and decided, her husband decided he didn't want to be Mrs. Sunstone. And so they were leaving Sunstone. And she called me throughout the fall of 1985 and asking me to come and take over Sunstone from her. And I always told her no, because I'd seen how running, because she was publisher and editor, and running the business side and the editorial side had just ground her down and burnt her out. And I'd seen her spend, 18 hours there, 10 o'clock at night calling people on the phone, begging for money, and she just couldn't do it all. And I wasn't going to burn myself out like Peggy did.
What was your job before joining Sunstone full-time?
I had a job in Montgomery County, Maryland, as a community planner for their city planning department.
Okay.
So
what changed your mind about joining?
Well, they since I said no, and in the meantime they punted and hired Daniel Rector to be a half-time business manager for Sunstone. And since they didn't have anyone else really to turn to, they organized a group of 4 people to be head of the transition, 4 people from the board of trustees, which included, I think, John Ashton, Kent Frogley, Jay Bonner-Ritchie, and I can't remember who the 4th person was, maybe Mary Beth Raines. Mm-hmm. And so they had decided to basically turn Sunstone over to Daniel Rector.
Tell us about Daniel.
Daniel was a great guy. Never seen a person with more self-confidence and chutzpah. Really believed he could do almost anything. He had a strong interest in Mormon theology, but as a career, he bounced around. He sold used cars. He sold this. He'd done this. He'd done this, and he sort of came to Sunstone just because he really needed a job. But he liked Sunstone.
Wasn't he the son of someone prominent? Is that right?
Yes, his father was Hartman Rector Jr., a member of the 70 in the church. So his dad was a general authority, which helped Daniel and hurt Daniel sometimes. So Daniel agreed to do it, and a lot of people said, well, you need to get somebody, you need to get Elbert. And I was coming out for the Mormon History Association, which was being held in Salt Lake. And at the night before the MHA, Peggy was having her farewell banquet, which I was also going to go to. And they were also going to announce the new head of Sunstone, which would be Daniel. So while there for that week, Daniel and Bonner-Ritchie lobbied me very hard to come and take over, to be the editor of Sunstone. If Peggy was publisher-editor, Daniel would be the publisher, I would be the editor. And Bonner was a person who I'd always respected so much. He'd given a talk that Sunstone published that had a huge impact on me. And
which talk was that?
It's the Individual and the Institutional Church. It was a B.H. Roberts Society lecture that Peggy published. And so I pondered that whole thing. I prayed about it a lot. I remember once when I was walking around Temple Square, whether or not I should take Sunstone or not. It's just all diverging career paths. I was sitting down on a planter, and also in this pre-recorded music of the Tabernacle Choir started singing, and there was this hymn. I can't remember the title of the hymn, but there's a line in it that says, "Within the kingdom of his might, all is good and all is right," something like that. And it just hit me that if I do Sunstone and it's within the kingdom, it's an acceptable choice. And then I felt this spiritual prompting that told me it's okay to take Sunstone. It's not like God wanted me to take Sunstone, but it was an okay decision as long as I continued on a spiritual path. And so I decided, okay, I'd do it. And I went and told them I'd do that. We weren't very clear on the delineation of duties. And I guess in pitching it to me, Daniel particularly had pushed that we'd be an equal team. He'd be publisher and I'd be editor. And that caused a little friction later on because we hadn't clearly delineated that. So I came to Sunstone, and Sunstone was broke and beaten up and had no money, and supporters were all disillusioned because the last year of Peggy's tenure, she'd had no money and had been so burned out she'd come out with like 2 issues in a year. And
what were the subscription rates when you first joined? Do you remember roughly? Was it 1,000? Was it 500? Was it?
no, it's probably, it may have been 4,000,
Okay.
maybe 3,000 something.
Okay. In what ways was it a mess? Or struggling, or sort of?
Well, we had donors were disillusioned, thinking the organization was falling apart. In the years, Peggy's last tenure, and the board of trustees and people trying to save Sunstone were thinking of like bagging the magazine all together and just having the symposium, which was paid for itself money-wise. And the magazine was a drag, and Peggy, this visionary, would plead and beg. She would not give up on the magazine. And so we inherited the magazine Symposium, and we liked both of those, but there was like zero money. Not only zero money, we were hugely in debt. Daniel's first 2 years at Sunstone, or 3 years, was basically just paying off Peggy's debts. He, every time we go to a printer to print something, they'd say, oh yeah, they'd tell us this after they accepted our printing job. They'd call us and say, we've discovered in our files that you guys owe us $5,000 for some old magazine which you never paid us for. You took the magazine and ran off on. And before we give you this current thing, well, you have to pay us for the old one. And Daniel that happened weekly. We were just paying huge sums. And once after the symposium, we had a ton of money, for us, maybe $10,000 in the bank. And some old debt person we owed from Arizona sequestered our funds, and took them all from the bank, and so we were broke after the symposium. And on top of that, we owed maybe $60,000 to the IRS, because Peggy, in trying to make ends meet, would choose to pay people's weekly payroll rather than paying the IRS what she owed for deducting their taxes from their payroll. So we had a demanding schedule that we had to meet to repay the IRS loan, and we had to get magazines out, had to be confident, and we had zero money. It was hard, and we lived in a terrible place, and we worked in a terrible place, and didn't have any money. And we're working for almost nothing.
How did you keep your spirits up?
It was a cause. Those were some of the most best times of my life. It was really fun. And Daniel and I liked each other so much and worked so well. I talked to him about the issues I was debating on the magazine, and he cared so much about the magazine. We had great conversations, which really improved to have someone to talk to. And he was working with all the other issues. Fortunately, because of a previous job I had, I knew database, which our subscribers list was on. Daniel knew nothing about it, so I was able to work on our subscriber list. And Daniel would write fundraising letters and new subscription letters and run them by me, and we'd have it was a great collaborative experiment and experience, and it was just great times with no money and the wolf always beating at the door.
So when you joined, did you have a hope or a vision or an aspiration? It doesn't need to contrast with what came before. Did you have a hope or an aspiration or vision that you wanted to carry forward? Or did you have a new vision or hope or aspiration that you wanted to sort of, have as being your imprint for your tenure?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to carry the torch very well, because I'm in awe of Peggy Fletcher. She's one of my personal heroes. And she has this wonderful mind with great ideas, and she's always stretching further than she has the ability and resources. And I had caught on to so many of those ideas and wanted to help see them realized. And Scott Kenny, I didn't know personally when I came, but I also held him in awe. So part of it was just carrying the tradition. And but there were some things I wanted to do, which were not that unusual from what people had done before. I had developed a great interest in biblical scholarship and wanted to introduce more of Mormonism to that. Peggy and Scott had both had similar interest in that, and Daniel had an interest in that. So we instituted a scripture lecture series that met once a month and went along with the church's curriculum, and we brought in critical studies into scripture studies, both Bible, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and that was something we both loved doing, and it was really fun. People always think they're trying to reinvent this, but it's a continued problem. I wanted to bring in more, what I guess gets classified as faithful voices to Sunstone than than Peggy was able to do. And I was able to do that because I'd been at BYU so much involved with 70s Press and stuff. I knew a lot of these faculty members. So those first few years, we signed up dozens and dozens of BYU faculty members for the symposium program and got them to write and speak write for the magazine. Even Hugh Nibley, who was willing to do magazine and Sunstone sessions. And
who are some of the faithful voices that you could really rely upon, or that you felt were an important balance to the more liberal, left-leaning aspects of Sunstone?
Yeah, well, that's a bad dichotomy, as you no doubt realize, yes. Liberal, faithful. Because Eugene England is very liberal and he's very faithful. And at that time, Gene was participating more in Sunstone than he'd ever done before for his own quirky dynamics. People like David Whitaker in the BYU archives, who dealt with the Mormon collection, people like Jim Faulkner, people like Art Bassett in humanities, Jim Faulkner in philosophy, even Lou Midgley would participate, even people in the history department, and some people from the Smith Institute. Jill Durr would participate. You just go through the symposium program, there were a lot. There were and they'd write book reviews for us, they'd write articles, they'd speak at symposium, they'd respond to sessions in symposium. It was really fairly easy in those late 1980s to get BYU people involved, which is part of my vision. Daniel's vision was to have that. We kind of wanted everyone who had an intellectual interest in Mormonism to be in the tent, talking to each other and listening to each other. I sort of believe that that's a naive philosophy, but it certainly was my guiding philosophy on that. In terms of other things I did at Sunstone in those early years, we revived a lot of traditions that I liked that had been dropped by whatever reason over the years. Like in the early Sunstones, they would regularly publish plays, and they hadn't in the last half decade. And so we revived the publishing of plays, and we published more poems than had been published in the past, and found ways to frame them so that they used to dedicate a whole page to a poem in a magazine, which meant you couldn't print many poems because you couldn't dedicate many pages to a whole poem. But by creating space at the end of articles, we'd do more poems. Once Eugene England criticized me for just using poems as filler, and that hurt because we were working very hard to create space to put poems in. So then we came up with the idea of putting icons on top of the poems and putting more blank space around them to frame the poem better, so it wouldn't look like we were just using them as filler. There are a bunch of other magazine things that we did, old traditions that we revived. I guess one of the things, it wasn't new to Sunstone, but it was really new to the magazine, was cartoons. Sunstone under Peggy had published 3 cartoon books by Calvin Grandal, but he wasn't a regular feature in the magazine. And we recruited Pat Bagley and Calvin Grandal to have Mormon cartoons in each issue, and then we had put tons of other cartoons. That was a major contribution of ours.
Are there any cartoons that stand out as your favorite, or that you really, we could probably go back and interlay some of them over your description of them? That's putting you on the spot, but no.
Yeah, well, cartoons actually became one of our most controversial problems, but I just left a lot of Cal Grandal, so there's tons of them.
So what role were you hoping Sunstone would play within Mormonism? What was your vision for its, let's say that in a soup, there's salt and there's carrots and there's beef or whatever. There are lots of ingredients. What was the role that Sunstone played in the ingredients to Mormon culture or the Mormon experience?
I came to articulate this more later, but it was inherent in my early approach. It was the idea of an open forum, which was a place where people can come and speak truth as they understand it, scholars and laity, people who have experiential truth to tell, and people who have academic research, and non-Mormons who are interested in Mormon studies or who can do reflections to bring them on us that will help us. And in that discussion, by people who believe and people who do not believe, but honest civil discussion, it can produce some fruits that might be helpful to Mormonism. But we really didn't have, and I didn't have, a studying the ark like the church needs this. Although I believe the church needs something like that. It was primarily for the people who'd be interested in this. I always believed that the subset of Mormonism that would be interested in this should grow and grow and grow, because the number of college-educated Mormons each year were growing and growing. And even if we just took a few of those who had true intellectual curiosity, Sunstone should be on a growth track. And that sort of played out a little bit in the late 80s when we came. I came in 86. Daniel and I came. And Daniel was rigorous in trying to get new subscribers, and would send out these promotional letters and bring them in, and it was bringing in money, and we were growing and growing. At our peak, about the time Daniel left, or just a year before he left, I guess, we had 10,000 subscribers. And a lot of those came from, we published this issue when Apostle Native American George P. Lee, no, Apostle 70, quit the church, and he wrote a handwritten manifesto of why he was leaving, and criticized the church. And because we're also kind of have a news portion on the side of the magazine, and certainly I felt a need to sort of be a magazine of record for the important things that happen. We published George Lee's letters, which in my mind were really kind of crazy, but it showed people what a crazy guy he was. Well, it turns out tons of Mormons wanted to read those letters, very faithful Mormons, and they were willing to plunk down $30 for a subscription just to get the issue that had the George P. Lee letters. It was pre-internet days, they couldn't read them online. And we got several thousand subscribers just from that promotion. In fact, that may be the only issue of Sunstone that was reprinted. We printed it again to use it just as a promotional magazine.
So the newspapers wouldn't print them?
Well, they printed excerpts from them, but they didn't print the entire things. It was like a long, long thing. And that was very helpful and brought in tons of subscribers. A couple of years later, the journalist Lynn Packer wrote his article about Paul Dunn and his fabricated stories. And Sunstone has an intimate history involved in that. I'd heard through rumors at BYU that Lynn Packer, because he was once a journalist and professor at BYU, that he had all this stuff on Boyd K. Packer, on Paul Dunn. And I asked him to come and present it at the symposium. And he sent us this paper, which was just this angry diatribe full of facts, but he'd call him liar, liar, pants on fire in the paper and stuff. And Daniel and I didn't feel like we could just let him speak that tone of attack about Paul Dunn. It needed to be more dispassionate journalism. So we didn't let him give the paper at the symposium. And Lynn, being a good journalist, sold his research basically to the Arizona Republic. And they bought his research and his information and wrote their own story rather than going with his. And when the story broke, then we decided to be what Sunstone does best, perhaps, rather than a breaking news journal, which we're not, a reflective voice. So we took the Lynn Packer article, which had more than the Arizona Republic series did, and we edited it down, and then we reprinted the Arizona Republic things, and then we invited a bunch of people to reflect on the Paul Dunn stories from many different angles. We had a person who's in the English department in Iowa, who's not a Mormon, who's dealt with how people tell stories and they're full of non-truths. And we had Mormon historians and Man in the Street and lots of different people reflect on it, which made the segment on Paul Dunn grew and grew and grew so much that it was very large, and so we put it on the cover. And then, and this was also in pre-internet days, there were all these jokes that were running around about Paul Dunn because of this. And people didn't have the internet, but fax machines were very popular then. And so they were like a Mormon samizdat, where these cartoons were being faxed all around the church. And so we thought we would document that part of this Mormon subculture of the Paul Dunn episode. And because the thing had taken so much space, I didn't want to dedicate a page or two more to the Paul Dunn things. And we had a lot of empty space at the end of all these little articles we had about Paul Dunn. So I spread the cartoons out. And in our introductory part of that, we said these cartoons are here just to document what was happening at the time, and we're just reproducing them. We didn't commission them. Well, no one reads the introductory thing. Daniel printed a huge number of that Paul Dunn issue, thinking that it would be a great promotional issue the way the George P. Lee one had been. And lots of people got upset, both about the volume of space of the magazine we dedicated to it. They thought, but they were just also mad about any discussion of Paul Dunn. And then the cartoons made them think that we were attacking Paul Dunn, and that was our motives. And so people were like mad at us for beating up on Paul Dunn. And I guess there's a big difference between being an excommunicated general authority, who people didn't have such an emotional attachment to, like they did with Paul Dunn, and if he's excommunicated,
George Lee,
George Lee, yeah, GeorgeLee, they didn't have the emotional attachment like they did with Paul Dunn, who'd been a very popular speaker for decades.
He was disfellowshipped or censured, but not.
Yeah, whatever. We don't know the actual discipline on him, but he wasn't excommunicated, at least publicly, and so George P. Lee's excommunicated, so you can find out the dirt about that scoundrel. But Paul Dunn's a little more questionable, and you like him better anyhow. And so people are mad at you, and he's not excommunicated. Had he been excommunicated, they may, and publicly it's known that was the case, they may have welcomed the issue, but they didn't. So we got people canceling subscriptions over that. And when Daniel sent out this promotional letter, which was like the same letter that he'd sent out with George P. Lee, except changing Paul Dunn for George P. Lee, we had a week where we couldn't do anything in the office except field phone calls from people who weren't subscribers but were just mad at us. And they were calling on a toll-free 800 number, which was costing us money, and they just yelled at us. And there were like four or five of us in the office all the time, always taking phone calls for this whole week from people who were just furious at us for that issue.
So you felt, there's a sense to where you could look at that as it's like the buzzards or the vultures circling on the carcass, I'm sure that wasn't your intent, but I'm sure it could have easily been viewed.
Some people, the people who were calling us were not subscribers. They were the average member whose names, Daniel would acquire these mailing list names. There was a very Mormon magazine called This People, and he'd trade and get their subscriber list. And then he'd get the BYU Studies list. And then he just got every mainstream kind of Mormon list he could get. We would send promotional letters to, inviting them to take Sunstone. So these were people who, many of them had never read a Sunstone before, but they read this promotional letter. And they do think we're a buzzard taking advantage of him. I'm actually proud of the content of that issue. I think the collection of essays are reflective and sensitive and very good on the topic. Even some of our best supporters, though, however, thought it was too much. It was disproportionate for the issue. Even after all the years and really thinking about those, I don't think that was the case. I think it was an important issue that really needed to be discussed. And Sunstone was the only place that it was discussed. And that is one of the main jobs that Sunstone does. It allows for that kind of discussion on issues that are basically taboo. Newspapers report it when it happens and then move on. And where else is there a reflective forum? Certainly before the internet, there was no other place but Sunstone. And it did a good job, I think.
Well, any other landmark issues that really come to mind as being either controversial or inspirational or groundbreaking? I'm sure you're proud of them all. But any others stand out in your mind?
Well, there are articles I went at, and certainly some covers I went at, but nothing of the magnitude of the Paul Dunn issues. There were topics that were perennial topics throughout the magazine, and
what were some of those?
Well, the tension between the intellectual and the institutional church. It had begun before us with the fight over the church historians in the Camelot years. And Sunstone under Peggy, she started, and we continued it, a whole series discussing that. And but then it spilled over into general intellectuals, and lots of people got involved in that topic. David Bowen, political science professor at BYU, wrote numerous articles. He started on the history thing and kind of moved into the intellectual thing. And of course, people like Paul Toscano would write and speak about it, Michael Quinn, and it became just a perennial topic. And the emotional pitch of it crescendoed over time as the church disciplines increased too. But there were a lot of faith-promoting things. I'm really proud of the Ed Kimball, the law professor at BYU and President Kimball's son and biographer, was on our board of trustees. He and Bonner Ritchie are good friends. And he was very good. I enjoyed his counsel, which he gave regularly. And he actually recruited articles for us of the more faith-promoting nature. He dug up this article on Spencer Kimball and the service station guy, this inactive Mormon who President Kimball would patronize his service station and recruit him to be active again. It's quite a little touching story. And then he got us this other article. I don't know if he got us this one, but this guy who wrote about President Benson in his last years, which I personally thought was a little zany as an article, but a lot of people found it very touching and endearing. Those were fun projects. I don't know if I'm especially more proud of them than anything else, but I have a kind of quirky fondness for them in my heart. I liked our Pillars of Our Faith, which is a perennial favorite, and some very good ones. I really liked Eloise Bell's and Kathleen Flake's.
Any presentations during the symposiums that stand out as being important or inspirational or controversial, let's say pre-1993? Anything stand out?
Yeah, every symposium has its memorable moments, and there's great stories. You have to get me saying them. I guess the one which, I don't know if Scott talked about this, this was in 1989, Elder Oaks had given his talk on alternate voices, which was clearly about Sunstone, and maybe not exclusively, but so we had a panel to talk about that, and that was a fiery night. I moderated the panel, and I guess this was 1979, the 10th anniversary of the symposium. 89, thank you. Back at the University of Utah, and I remember that night. I was moderating it, and we had Levina Fielding Anderson on it, and Marie Cornwall, and then Larry Young. Was Larry Young on it? No. Someone else. Who else was it? I can't remember. And Orson Scott Card. And Orson Scott Card was one of the people I was so proud of. He'd been an early contributor to Sunstone during the Scott Kenny years. He was prolific, so much so that he had 4 or 5 articles in one issue that he ghost wrote under different names because he had so many articles. He even once reviewed his own play under a different name in the magazine. And but he dropped off. But I liked Scott and really worked hard in getting him to write. And he agreed to be a columnist for the magazine. And he chose the name for his column, A Changed Man, meaning he's sort of a born-again mainstream Mormon, whereas he'd been a little liberal before. And he wrote very provocative columns that offended a lot of people, but a lot of people were damn glad he was in the magazine. So he was on his alternate voices panel. And trying to get people to speak intelligently about this. And Marie Cornwall spoke and gave this, she's a professor of sociology at BYU. She gave this little speech where at the end she says, and we're just like matches with our kids with our matches in our hand, ready to strike them. And it was not clear what the metaphor was, whether we're going to burn down the church or what, but it was an incendiary metaphor. And then the other BYU faculty member, who was that? I can't remember right now, and Marie, then they realized they may get in trouble for their BYU connection, so they shut up. So I'd have Levina, who would say more provocative things, and Scott Card, who would say provocative things. And I turned to the BYU faculty to kind of give countering things, and because the sociologists are really good at putting things in a context. And they would like just be mum. So we had these two people. And then it turns out Scott Card and Lavina had this history when they both worked at the Ensign years ago where they hated each other. And so we had this little cat fight between them. Now we're just trying to moderate, and then Scott Card says something about how he'd been so good friends with Scott Kenny in organizing and founding Sunstone. And but now he's really sad about how Scott Kenny, the journey he'd taken. And turns out they hadn't talked in years. And Scott Kenny's in the audience, So, and when it's time for audience comments, Scott Kenny comes up and makes this little response to Scott Card. So they're having this thing. And then Scott Card is keeping saying provocative comments, saying, you guys don't understand the brethren, and he's trying to defend the church. And Ron Prittis started booing, and people around him started booing Scott Card. And it was a session that just got out of control. The more moderate voices just shut up because they didn't want to get in trouble with their employer. And later that night, as I was walking Scott Card to his car, he says, these are not my people, Elbert. They booed me. They actually booed me. I said, oh, it's just Ron Prittis. You have a fight with Signature Books anyhow over the book you and Cal Grandal did. And he says, I don't know. These are not my people. I'm not ever going to come again. I said, lots of people like you. And think of the Washington Symposium, which you've come to. He really liked that. He says, well, maybe I'll do the regional symposiums. But he never did anything ever after that, which was sad because one of the things I really wanted to do when I came to Sunstone was increase a discussion about building Zion, which was a passion of mine at the time. And Daniel Rector supported me in that. And so we organized a theme symposium, maybe the only theme symposium Sunstone's ever had, on Zion. And we got Scott Card to come out and speak at it. And he so enjoyed that experience. And there were so many BYU faculty and even church employees who spoke at that and some of them got in trouble for doing that afterward. And Scott liked it so much, but it was not well attended because it was held in Provo. And so we were losing money on it. And Scott put a couple $1,000s on his American Express to help pay our hotel bill. He was, so I have really high moments with him, and then that holy meltdown at that symposium on the alternate voices.
Any other funny or inspirational or charged symposium presentations worth mentioning that come to mind? No pressure. That was a fun story. So.
There are many. You have to get me going. I could just tell them because there's all of them.
Go for it.
Well, one of the things I introduced at Sunstone was for the symposiums, I really wanted to position us as faithful people discussing the church rather than as malcontents. And so I introduced prayers at the symposiums, opening and closing prayers at the sessions, which it's hard to believe that now, but that was a controversial act. I don't think I've had more people come up to me in the hallways and criticize me for turning Sunstone into sacrament meeting. And at the very first one, where Lynn Pearson spoke, wow, was that a session? She was promoting her book that had just come out on the death of her ex-husband from AIDS. What's that book titled?
No More Goodbye. No, I'm sorry. Goodbye, I Love You.
Goodbye, I Love You. And she's really quite a self-promoter, and you have to admire that in a single woman now. But Dan had scheduled her for the day and Hugh Nibley to speak that night, and Carolyn insisted that Hugh Nibley be bumped. And so it was put upon me, and I was in Washington at the time, to negotiate that so Hugh wouldn't be so miffed that he would cancel. And we were able to do that. So we had this evening session with Lynn Pearson. This was 1986, I guess. And it's probably the largest Sunstone Symposium session ever held. It was the ballroom at the Sheraton, which is now the Hilton, I guess. And it packed the room to overflowing. And Carolyn speaks, and Marty Bradley, who was a member of the board, was chairing that session. And she was so nervous about introducing the prayers that she didn't really have a vocabulary or presiding style to do it naturally. She felt like she was making a dramatic statement, so she skipped over the prayers. So we didn't have prayers at that time. But Carolyn speaks, and she is so melodramatic in her speaking style, and the room is just packed with her. There's this huge gay contingent and a huge feminist contingent, and then just people who are interested in Carolyn. I mean, there must be 3,000 people in this room, just crammed, and she's just so melodramatic, and the high pitch was just. I don't know. You just remember that. I've never seen a session so high pitched as that.
In terms of her voice, or in terms of just the tension in the room, in terms of the
tension in the room, and the faithful people wanting to hold on the Carolyn they knew at BYU, who wrote all her beautiful poems, and the feminists holding on to the feminist Carolyn, and the gays holding on to the gay friendly Carolyn, and they're not really all getting along, but there's nothing spoken that was dramatic. But Carolyn's style is so melodramatic. She doesn't speak in complete sentences. She speaks in phrase fragments. And then I said to him, and punctuated with these dramatic pauses and sighs and heavy laden words. It was quite an evening.
Talk about Eugene England and your memories of him, both interacting with him and in whatever interaction he may have had with either writing articles or presenting at Sunstone. If you have a story or two.
I have a lot of Eugene England stories. He's one of my all-time favorite people, and one of the most frustrating people in the world to work with, because Gene is naive and idealistic. I mean, he really believes that proving contraries, truth will be made manifest. And if you get people together, they will talk. And he's tried that so many times, and sometimes they will talk, and if they understand each other, something will happen where truth will emerge from the synthesis of them. And that doesn't happen often, or maybe even usually. Often they fully understand the other person, they still disagree and even hate. But Gene's always pushing for that naivete. And I would say the worst thing that ever happened to Eugene England was the word processor. He, as he got older, and as technology increased, his papers became longer and longer. Any thought he had, any quote, anything, he would just throw in. So they'd become these 80, 90, 100-page papers, and he'd like to give them. And he'd want not only 90 minutes, but 2 hours to present a paper, And then if he couldn't, he'd want to publish the whole thing. And they were just long things. And I remember the California Symposium where he was giving the evening plenary session, a closing one, and he spoke for more than 2 hours. And even his diehard faithfuls were just dead. But every word was important to Gene because he loved ideas and words. But
how could you capture Gene for a new generation that has never even thought of Bruce R. McConkie, let alone Eugene England? How could you tell a new generation his personality or importance to our heritage and history within Mormonism? What did he represent? What did he embody to you? What was his legacy?
Gene believed in ideas, and he was more of a cause fighter. So he promoted issues that he thought were important. Blacks in the priesthood, which he inherited from his mentor, Lowell Benyon, and peace issues, particularly peace issues. And so he had this genius for presenting things that would kind of rile you up to want to care. And he cared so much. And he was fantastic. Never was a better person in titling his papers, which basically the title tells you everything. You almost need to know why the church is as important as the gospel, why the church is as true as the gospel. And which was a great call for the importance of community and socializing in the church. But the most important thing about Gene, which really only lives in his generation, is his enormous, generous spirit. I mean, when he called you my friend, you never had a higher honor in the world, and he didn't take things personally. If you disagreed with him or yelled at him for doing something, never would a person repent more fast and more genuine, and want to have love cover everything, all the differences. And he was stubborn, he was sure of his ideas, and he would push them and always challenge these things and believed in them, and you liked that about him even though you disagreed with him. And he liked everyone. He wanted to include them all. He was a true Christian person who was smart and intelligent, and his passion and his care for the ideas he was just terrific.
If you had to lift up, let's just say 3 or 4 more people as important or representative for what Sunstone was trying to be while you were working, who are some of the other people that a new generation should come to know through their writings or speeches or just their personalities? Do you have even 2 or 3 people that you would say that you could describe and maybe tell a story about? Sort of like if there were trading cards, like baseball trading cards for for your Sunstone years, who would be on those cards? And describe each one.
Well, I suppose they're their big names. For their writings and the personality is Lowell Benyon. I consider it one of my greatest blessings of Sunstone is to get to know Lowell Benyon. He was very thoughtful in his writings, and he had this sociology training from the 30s, and yet he never spoke like he had that training, but you can see that sociological perspective coming through all his theology writings. And he like Gene, believed that the outcome was the most important thing, what we did and what we thought, how we acted. And he would use his theology to push those things. A little more honest sometimes in his theology, but not completely. Lowell would say it's more important to promote the kind of God that promotes goodness in us than it is to adhere to the actual teachings of the Bible about God. So he'd be a little more. He's not a pure academic.
He's pragmatic.
He is very pragmatic, and the pragmatic that he wants is a life full of richness and spirituality and creativity and interconnectedness and service and love and grace, and you live that in a community. And I mean, Lowell, he may not have believed that the Book of Mormon was historical. It's hard to tell, really, but you read his writings on the Book of Mormon, and the themes that he's pulling out from it are all those very good works kind of themes. And just a great guy to be around. You liked being around Lowell Benyon. My heroes, I guess, are more of the people who did more for people and building the organization than the writings. Like Leonard Arrington, he's a first-rate booster of people. He believed in the careful, thoughtful study of history and of Sunstone and of Mormonism. And he'd encourage people to do that all the time. Every year, when we sent out the symposium flyer, the first registration for the symposium that came back was Leonard Arrington's. And he did that so intentionally. It wasn't just that he was a type A person who always had to take care of those things immediately. I think he wanted to make the point that I'm supporting you and I'm there with you. And it was such a joy to get Leonard's registration in the mail. And he'd always write letters encouraging people to do things, and if you asked him to do something, he was very willing to help. Once I asked him to review a book, and he said, let me think for a moment. And then he said, I don't think I can review that book. He says, because I think I would have to give it a bad review. And it wouldn't be very helpful for that person to have a bad review from Leonard Arrington because of his position in the society. He says, other people could give him a bad review and that'd be fine. But Leonard would really use his position to try to boost people up and encourage the growth of other intellectuals. He was just a great guy. And
how about a couple women?
The next woman I was going to say was Esther Peterson, but she didn't have a lot to do with Sunstone, so it's probably not the kind of person you want. Lavina Fielding Anderson is just a wonder. She's also just this fomenter and this organizer who is loving and gracious and kind and fun to be with. She's passionate and she's caring, and that is the biggest tragedy of excommunications, is Levina. She's such a true believer. And despite what the church saw as these criticisms of her, that they couldn't see her really good-hearted motivations behind that, it's very, very, very sad. She's incredible. Peggy Fletcher, of course, is just a god to me. I love Peggy with all my heart. And it was her passionate idealism that came through. She had this vision and she wanted to do it, and she would push for it, and she'd get all these rich men, people who like to be involved in the cause and stuff, and to support it, but she really cared about ideas and consequences. She's a little cause fighter from the 60s, and Mormon scholarship became her cause. She was terrific.
How about who represents history, sort of the historian, the archetypal historian for what you think emerging historians should strive for? Or one or two. I mean, you don't have to say the, but is there anyone you could lift as saying their history was something that you think was exemplary, their approach or their rigor?
Well, I'm a big fan of Jan Ships, who's a great personal friend and who I got to know through Sunstone and other things. I like Jan because she's one of the few people who really take the big picture. And most of her, I think her greatest work is not yet published. It's her work in progress on the church in the late 20th century, post-World War II church. But she really gets Mormonism on the big picture, whereas most Mormon history is about a person, a biography, or about a time period, and they get involved in little details. Jan just has a huge scope and she really can get inside of what is happening. Why are we doing correlation? What is the difference between correlation and just administrative reform? And yet they're all lumped together. And she really can sort out what's happening in Mormonism better than anyone I know. She's incredible. I think Mormon history, the writing of Mormon history, for the most part, has been pretty insular and parochial. Sometimes it's very excellent scholarship that is written by and for Mormons. So I respect the people who are trying to write for a non-Mormon audience as well as a Mormon audience, like Kathleen Flake, I think, although she came late to Mormon history in her career, I think she really has great promise. And I lament that Ron Walker was not able to write his multi-volume biography of Hubert Grant. He's a great storyteller, and those early chapters that he gave at MHA, and at least one was published in Sunstone during Peggy's years, were great.
What happened to it?
Well, the archives were closed, and you couldn't read the Grant correspondence or manuscripts or collection anymore. So it basically ended the research.
You had to stop research.
Yeah.
Some of our viewers will know that 1993 was sort of a crucial and defining moment for Sunstone in not potentially all positive ways. So can you discuss the events and the environment that led up to August and September of 1993 and your involvement in it, how you were trying to manage it, what you experienced about it, the events themselves and the aftermath? It's a big question, but we've got at least 30 minutes. So.
Well, we'll see. Okay. I don't know how far back you want me to go.
Give whatever context you think would be informative for future generations.
Well, I think there's an inherent institutional conflict between the church and any independent organization. I mean, so that's the first context that needs to be put in. I mean, the church was nervous with this People magazine, which was a very faithful Mormon-y magazine. They were nervous with Farms, which was kind of doing their bidding, or at least some of their bidding. They just don't like, they're nervous with Bookcraft, the Mormon publisher, which they bought, Deseret Book bought out, which was out Deseret Book. They just don't like that. And so that's the first context, that they're nervous with any independent thing that they don't have control over. And that's probably just inherent in organizations, and for whatever reasons is aggravated in the church. And then the tension with intellectuals goes way back, goes back to the Godbeites, goes back to Scott Kenny's grandfather, E.E. Erickson in the 1930s, when J. Reuben Clark slammed down his social works, and goes back to Fawn Brodie and Juanita Brooks, and the tension that the church had with dialogue in the 1960s. In a priesthood meeting, even President Harold B. Lee, counseled people not to read it. And that nervousness was always with Sunstone too. It was kind of low level on the radar. And but it was always there from when Scott went and talked to his old mission president, Boyd K. Packer, and Peggy would have her tensions when she was there. And in the early 80s, Gordon Hinckley, as counselor, the only active counselor in the first presidency, would make comments about the critics inside and outside the church. They're nervous of them. They don't appreciate any main contribution they can have.
Well, did you say there were actual direct conversations between Scott or Peggy and general authorities during the time Sunstone was alive about Sunstone's role or its approach? Do we know if there were any direct conversations?
Yeah, did Scott tell you when he went to Boyd K. Packer?
No.
Boyd K. Packer was Scott's mission president.
Right, he told me that.
And when he was organizing Sunstone, he went and had a meeting with Boyd K. Packer.
Okay.
So,
what's the best? I mean,
I get Scott to tell you about that, or he actually is written about in the Sunstone history on his section, on his time. But, so yes, and Peggy had talked to some general authorities. Peggy's related to general authorities. Her great-grandfather was Heber J. Grant. And so when Daniel and I came to Sunstone, we wanted to be more faithful. We wanted to have everyone in the tent speaking. We got all these BYU professors coming, and we are getting more subscriptions from mainstream Mormons. And Gordon Hinckley was even increasing his comments about his passing comments about critics inside and outside the church. He would say, we don't need them. We don't listen to them. And Elder McConkie had given his talk about the caravan moves on and the yapping dogs who get left behind. And, so Daniel and I decided to go have a meeting with President Hinckley, who was a counselor at the time, and invite him to speak at a symposium. And I think primarily because of Daniel's dad being a general authority, we got this interview. This must have been in 1987, or 86, one of the two. And President Hinckley took us in his office and sat down, was warm and friendly and congenial. And I proposed the question to him, the invitation to him. He goes, no, I don't need to speak there, thank you, but no, to the invitation. And so I came back again and said, well, you don't really speak in a lot of detail about your reservations about the critics inside and outside the church. Could you come and speak a little more in detail to these people so they could understand your reservations and everything? He says, no, I have all the forums to speak, and I say just what I want to say. And then he turned on us and says, well, I've got some questions for you. And he says, who called you to this? Who called you to this? Yes, a man must be called by authority in order to preach the gospel. Who called you to run Sunstone? And we responded, man must not be called in all things. You can do a lot of things on your own independent free will and this sort of stuff. And he kind of nodded like that's a good response. And I can't remember the other questions, but there was on the spot, he would come up with these 3 or 4 rhetorical questions he'd put to us. And he put them in a genial way, like, these are just things I think you need to consider, And then I said, I really do think Sunstone can help the church. And I hit a button with that one. He goes, oh, I've heard that argument before. Peggy Fletcher used to tell me that Sunstone could really help the church. He says, and then he says, But like the time she was friends with Ken Woodward, that religion editor at Newsweek, and she showed him all around when he was doing his article on the MTC and the missionaries. We don't need help like that. And then he says, I know Petra's family. And he recited her genealogy, and her grandfather's a senator, her uncle's a senator, her mother's a Bennett. No, not her mother's not Bennett. Her mother's a Bennett. Her father's a Fletcher. And they're related to all these people. And grandfather's her grand, and her uncle, her great uncle, was his missionary companion, Gordon Hinckley's missionary companion. And then after reciting her genealogy, which he knew intimately, which you get from all these old-time families here in Utah, everyone knows everyone who's connected in their lines. He says, considering who her family is, she should know better. She was, and so the thing ended, and Daniel, who was really kind of overcome with love for Gordon Hinckley, who I don't think President Hinckley comes across genially in his speeches and stuff. I don't think he's a very demonstrative person in terms of his affections. Daniel went up to him and embraced him, and I watched as Hinckley kind of hesitantly embraced him back, and so I hugged him too, and then as we left, I remember saying to Daniel as we're leaving the church administration building, at a minimum he has to say, I don't agree with those guys, and I think they're wrong-headed in their approach, but their motives are good, and they're trying to do good, And Daniel said, that's probably what his final conclusion would be. Boy, were we wrong. John Ashton, whose father was Marvin J. Ashton, and John was a liberal on our Sunstone board, came back to us a couple of weeks later, furious. And Marvin Ashton, or John Ashton, said to us, quit trying to talk to those guys. Just leave them alone. They're never going to get it, and the more you talk to them, the madder you make them. And I was of a different mindset at the time. I said, because we were sending them all complimentary issues. And John said, stop sending them the magazine. He says, and I said, well, if they can't be part of the conversation, at least it's healthy for them to overhear it and to know what people are saying. He says, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. They don't overhear the conversation. They just find things to get mad at. He says, they'll look through an issue, and maybe there are 4 or 5 great-ish articles that could appear in the Ensign. And you don't get any credit for this. You just get pinged for the one mad. And the more mad ones they get, I'd say, but isn't it better for them to read the whole article than just to read highlighted parts that someone sends them, and where they just read those highlighted quotes? He says, no. He said, no, it's not. They don't think like that. All they do is they're trying to defend the church, and they just get mad that they see things that they think are wrong, and particularly if they can't, you won't stop when they tell them to. And so Daniel and I thought, well, John probably knows more than we know. After all, his father's an apostle. And but we didn't want to just stop sending them the magazines. So they, because then they would say, why aren't we getting these anymore? Now they don't want us to know what they're saying. So we found a way to, that we thought we were very clever. We would send out a form letter saying to everyone, we got all these complimentary issues to send to people, and we're very happy to send them, but, we don't want to send magazines to people, to people who don't want them. So here's a return card. Could you just check, please continue sending me this or not, and send it back? And so it's their choice, sort of. And I remember the day we got back, en masse, all of the cards from the apostles. They'd all been checked by the same blue pen. It's like they talked about us in a quorum. They said, okay, John, you collect the cards and send them all back, or the executive secretary or something. They were all just perfectly checked by the same hand, same pen, same kind of check. Whereas it was a mixed bag from the 70s. Some 70s would say, yes, I appreciate you sending this to me, and others would say, no, no, no. They didn't all get the memo that the 12 did. And then...
Did you have the signature of the members of the 12?
No, they had their name on it, I guess. Maybe I can't remember, we probably put their mailing label on it or something.
So they were paying attention. They wanted to keep getting it.
Now the 12 did. The 12 all said no. A few 70s said yes.
The 12 all said no?
All said no. All checked by the same pen,
Okay.
all no. It's like one person filled out all of their cards. They turned in all their cards to one person and they all filled out. I'd like to know that story, but some 70 said yes, although many said no. And then, but it shows you how out of touch some people are. The Relief Society presidency sent the cards back, checked yes, with flowing, flattering comments. Thank you, appreciate the good work you're doing. You know, and so most of the 12, all the 12 and most of the general authorities were no longer getting the magazine, which is probably a good thing, but probably too late. Then a year later or so, 1987, this would have been. No, 1987 was the Alternate Voices talk by Dallin Oaks, warning people against critics inside and outside the church. And then there were changes made in the temple endowment. And a lot of the press reported those changes in the temple endowment.
Around 1989, 90, something like that.
89. And like 87 was the Alternate Voices, 89 was the temple endowment. It's like these 2-year increments as you lead up to the crescendo. And lots of newspapers reported the changes in the temple endowments, the elimination of the blood oaths, you know, and the slitting of the throat and stuff, and getting rid of some certain things. And we, in our little news section, often reports how the media are covering the church. And so we did a news story about the news coverage of the changes in the temple. And we didn't really report in any detail what was happening, what was actually changed in the temple. But after that, shortly after that issue came out with that news story, I was called in by my stake president, who upbraided me very strongly for having run that article. And he said it was bad judgment and breaking of my temple covenants. And I tried to have a discussion with him, like, well, what you actually covenant in the temple and what you covenant not to reveal, we didn't reveal any of those things. And that didn't matter to him, and he really didn't want to discuss it. And he took my temple recommend away. And so I went in the next day to the office and told Daniel about that, and we talked about what to do about that. And then a couple of days later, and I also asked my stake president, now, were you told to do this? Have you had any conversations with anyone about this? He says, no one has told me to do this. I haven't received any conversations. It's just for some time I've been concerned about having a stake member of my stake do Sunstone, and this has broken the back. And but then a few days later, Daniel's stake president called him in and had a similar conversation, a little more polite, and took Daniel's recommend. So clearly, this thing was organized from the top, which later I happened to run into my area president. I was with Eugene England at some conference, and our area president was there, and Gene was saying, hey, let me introduce you, because Gene liked this area president, to Elbert Peck around Sunstone. You know, and Gene didn't know about our temple recommends being taken, but the area president clearly knew, and he said to me, as he shook my hand, he says, I know about everything that's been happening to you and Daniel. And he says, let me tell you, it came from far above me. You know, so my stake president lied through his teeth to me, which he lost all credibility with me at that moment. Daniel's parents were abhorred that his recommend was taken and really hounded him to get it back. And so, because of his dad and mom, Daniel worked very hard in meeting and talking to his stake president, and a year later had his temple recommend restored. And maybe a little after that, Daniel left Sunstone. But I didn't want to ever talk to that stake president again, so we just let it go. I didn't have a temple recommend. Daniel and I had decided to keep that secret. We didn't want to become martyrs for the cause, have it be publicized about. But a few of our friends found out about it, and our good friend Pat Bagley, the cartoonist, told the reporter at the Tribune, and so she wrote a story about it, and it appeared in the press, much to our chagrin. So our temple recommends were taken. And the way I sort of see the church doing these things is I think the brethren feel like they sent clear messages through Elder Oakes's talk, through the taking of the Temple Recommends, and then there became
Hinckley talking to you.
that was private, but yeah, I think they feel, and I've heard reports where they say, the true saints, only a whisper and only a hint, and they'll follow it. And the more or less faithful ones, if you even tell them explicitly, they won't follow it anyhow. And clearly, we weren't following the whisperings or the gentle counsel of President Hinckley. And so I think they're getting more and more frustrated. At the same time, they're probably hearing more about Sunstone. The number of our readers have increased to 10,000 by now. I think we have a lot more visibility. They probably have more people in Salt Lake talking and asking them about Sunstone. And also the number of BYU faculty involved in the symposium, which I think one symposium was like 60 or 70 BYU people were in a symposium program. I think that troubled them too. It's like, we're paying these people and we're supporting these people. And so there started to be increased pressure not to let BYU people do it, And BYU was going through its 10-year review process, and they wrote into it that we don't want people to speak at Sunstone or write for dialogue. And so, but BYU faculty still would speak in large numbers. So I think the brethren are nervous about the exposure. And then we published the George P. Lee letters, which I'm sure they didn't appreciate. And then we published the Paul Dunn issue, which they didn't appreciate. So they're leading up to the 1993. There's probably on the brethren's part an apprehension that we need to do something about Sunstone. Our more quiet, gentle approach attempts haven't been responded to. And this cancer is growing. I'm sure that all happens. And then comes the Sunstone Symposium of 1993, which turned out to be, I was going to say a little wild, but there turned out to have a lot of sessions in it that the brethren were very upset with. It also happened to coincide with the Salt Lake Tribune deciding to hire a reporter who would have a beat in religion. They happened to hire Peggy Fletcher, and she filed a lot of stories in the newspaper about speeches at the symposium. And as a good journalist, which she is, you cover the controversial stories. You don't cover the boring stories, And so things that would have been contained within the symposium now had a broader announcement in that context. So Dave Knowlton gets off the plane and comes back and gives his talk, which is about what's happening to the church in South America and the missionary program there. And you can almost take the statement on symposia that comes out a month later and identify which symposium session they're talking about, one point by point. What's his name? The columnist for the Deseret News, who's now Jewish and lives in Texas. What's his name?
Jolly?
Yeah, Clifton Jolly. Clifton Jolly proposes something for the symposium. Up until that point, Clifton Jolly had been a columnist for the Deseret News, So we thought, great, we want a Deseret News person in the thing. As an aside, my philosophy in organizing symposiums had been to spend almost all my time recruiting moderates and faithful people, so-called faithful, but moderate voices in the church, and conservatives if we could get them. And I didn't spend a lot of time recruiting the liberals because we got plenty of them coming in on their own, So we're happy Clifton Jolly makes a proposal. Daniel missed the alert signal when Clifton said to him, just before his session, I don't want my session to be recorded. Which, we don't record and disseminate them without their permission, so we didn't record it. And Peggy didn't report it, but it was still reported back to the brethren. And in that, Clifton, who knew he was going through a midlife crisis and in the process of leaving the church very angrily. And his whole thing is an attack on the church and on the church culture. And in the talk he says, Well, why even something like Sunstone is just not good after saying how the whole church was bad. And what we'd spend our time better if we just paired everyone up and went off in the cars and fucked each other like bunnies. And and he goes on and on, and then he crescendos to his concluding line, which is about the current president of the church. He says, "Well, Ezra, you fucked us again." In the Sunstone presentation, which all hairs people out, But there's no doubt, someone in the audience who is taking notes, because the church used to send people to regularly go and report on what happens in every symposium, who sends it back to the brethren. So, the line in the statement on the symposium about speaking ill and using bad language about the brethren and stuff, that's Clifton Jolly. And there were other sessions, which if I looked at, I could remember them all. But
there was the women one with Margaret Toscano and Lavina and Michael Quinn about. Was it if the women have had the priesthood since 1840?
That's right. Michael Quinn's statements, yes, in that session, particularly Michael Quinn's statements in that session, come up. And the brethren had been sort of moving in already in places, which is because Margaret Toscano had been called in earlier that year where they explored the possibility of having a disciplinary court about her, and so. That August, 2 weeks after the statement on symposium, the Thursday afternoon or Friday after the brethren meet in their meeting in their room, they issue their statement on symposia. It's curiously issued by the Council of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. Most statements come out from the First Presidency. My take on why that was issued by them is that at that time you had a weakened prophet pretty much out of it. And when that happens, the authority of the First Presidency and the counselors diminish, and you revert back more to collegial. And so they were speaking collectively as 15 because they really couldn't speak on a new topic as 3. And so I happened to be on a family beach trip in North Carolina when that statement is issued, and I get a phone call from Peggy wanting a quote for the newspaper about it. So that's sort of why I think the statement was issued. But all of those reports from the symposium that came at such a time, the Clifton Jolly, the David Knowlton, you're right, the Michael Quinn and the feminist quotes, and there were a couple other, they just said these people now have gone over the top.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I haven't known the history. And so I always just assumed you, as the editor, would have been reviewing all these things ahead of time, and that you would have even been complicit in some of the anger and rage that was starting to emerge. I've gone back and listened to a lot of these presentations, and I heard comments about, I was trying to use this title, but the editors told me I had to use this title. There were 3 other presentations we wanted to present that were actually more angry, but they were denied, and so this is the only one we got. So all I'm trying to say is, from what I understand, you were really trying to make sure that the tone was respectful, or as respectful as possible. But that's just, I'm not trying to...
No, that's right. No, that's true. We didn't know what Dave Knowlton was going to say, because I like Dave Knowlton's, his anthropological look on Mormonism from South America, which we published several popular articles of his, which I really liked. And he basically came right off the plane. And they threatened Dave Knowlton for doing damage to the missionaries, potential damage to the missionaries. That was the line from the statement on his. So we didn't know what he was going to say, and we didn't really know exactly what Clifton Jolly was going to say, which that's true. That's part of the dynamic of an open forum, is sometimes people say things that are irresponsible, and you need to you try your hardest to get responsible speakers, responsible voices, and sometimes that trust is violated. But my personal view was, my whole approach to dealing with this tension with the church is, I sort of have griefs rather than grievances, and I get sad rather than mad. And I like these people, and I disagree with them, and so I always want us to have to be more respectful. And so we do tone down. Well, the more boring sessions, we try to tone up their abstracts to get people to go to them. But the more inflammatory things, we try to tone down their titles. And I think an open forum doesn't mean anyone can say anything. It means any topic is not off limits. You don't censor because of the topic, and you don't censor because of the person. And like Michael Quinn, because you're excommunicated, you can't speak. But you do select based on quality of thought and thoughtfulness and respectful language, because that respectful language builds dialogue. Disrespectful language, no matter how right you are, alienates people, and that's always been my inclination, to try to get people to do that. And I often wonder if did I not censor people more, and that would that have served the cause in the longer run? And that's a complex process, because Sunstone is this organic social organization where people feel a right to be involved, and they're part of the community, and it's hard to tell a Levina or a person you can't speak at all. Sometimes you can say that topic really, not that the topic is wrong, but you're dealing with it needs to be a little more rigorous and a little more respectful, and you can have that kind of conversation with them. But you don't want to be banning everyone just because you're killing the organization that way rather than killing it the other way. But my own personal style would be much more tempered than some of the things that happened. And that's where we're facilitators of a group of people, and we're not the controllers of the group of people. You can only have such an impact so far. And the Mormon side was getting more and more high-pitched, and people were complaining, whereas early on, behavioral scientists like Bonner Ritchie, who probably started the whole thing in Sunstone with his institutional and individual church, he certainly introduced the phrase the institutional church, where people started talking about the institutional church, and you could criticize how we act dysfunctionally as an institution without necessarily criticizing God and the divinity of the church, and that kind of just grew as people were saying this doesn't help, and feminists really picked up on criticism of systematic institutional processes, and gays were starting to do the same thing, and then abuse victims were starting to do the same thing, and so you found an audience. You found more speakers who liked to criticize the church organizationally, and some of them were more amateurs than others, and you found an audience who was like wanting to hear that conversation more. It was kind of and so that's building up to the time. And because of the things like alternate voices talk and other talks, you see in the symposiums more and more people defending the rights of intellectuals, and more of them defending the right to speak freely in the church. And that's kind of an outgrowth from the Camelot years. Although ironically, the people who fought the Camelot Wars, who were a lot of them in the Smith Institute and other people, had pretty well made their peace with the church by the time the September 6th event came along, and they were not very sympathetic with what was happening there. Many of them thought Sunstone had gone too far. It's hard for people to make judgments, because they all make judgments on such limited knowledge. They hear about one session, or they hear about two sessions even, and say, oh, they're over the top. If they're doing that sort of stuff, they shouldn't be allowed to do it, and they shouldn't be happening. They're judging the whole from a very few. I should tell one more story before that September 6th. Before Daniel left, he'd run into Elder Packer in the park. Elder Packer had run into his father in the parking lot, but argued with Hartman Richter Jr. for not controlling his son more and getting him to quit Sunstone. And then I guess Elder Hartman Richter Jr. had a conversation with Elder Oakes about this also. So Daniel got mad because he felt, why are these people getting on my dad? My dad doesn't I'm an adult, my dad doesn't control me. So he called Elder Oakes and asked for an audience with Elder Oakes. This is after the alternate voices talk. So it's maybe 90, 91 maybe. I'm getting all these years wrong, but it doesn't matter. So Daniel goes and has his audience with Elder Oakes. And it's very interesting. Elder Oakes had taken the current symposium program and had categorized everything as non-theological or non-religious, something like on environmentalism or something. And then he had, for all the others, he had a spectrum from apostasy to questionable to this to innocuous, and it spread them out. And for a while, Elder Packer came in and joined the conversation with Daniel and Elder Oakes, but Daniel, both of them were pretty clear that on the far right of the spectrum, the far end of the spectrum was talking about the temple. That is the most radioactive thing you can do. And they said any discussion of the temple is off limits. And then theology was the next category. And theology is really a questionable project unless you're teaching the theology, the official theology of the church. And then they went on to history and other things. And when they were talking about theology, according to Daniel, Elder Packer said, well, that's what their really agenda is. They want to change the theology of the church. And so I think they clearly see, whereas certainly Daniel and I and most people, maybe most people at Sunstone, felt that this was a discussion group. They clearly saw it as an advocacy group, trying to tell the brethren how to run the church and how it should be changed. So they were very defensive about that. So they issued the statement on symposia, which brought a lot of response. Eugene England and Ed Kimball at BYU wrote a letter explaining how the statement wasn't really about Sunstone, because Sunstone doesn't do the things that they list in the statement, and published it in the Daily Universe at BYU, which I'm sure made the brethren furious at Gene. And it became harder after that to get subscribers. It became harder, and some people canceled, but not many. Most people, to cancel a subscription requires an active act, and most humans are like ourselves, lazy. They don't cancel a subscription, they just don't renew when it comes around. And so renewals can start to drop off after that. And it was harder to get the BYU people who we really liked, partly because they were academics and they raised our level of discourse as well as being moderates. And the year right after the symposium, there were a lot of academics who were mad at the statement on symposia, who kind of girded up their loins and said, if they can't do this, sign me up to speak this year. There were just a lot of heroics of faculty who would call and insisted to be in the symposium that year. And that was nice. But that didn't last long. It just became a hard battle. The sociology department at BYU once issued a letter from the whole department defending their participation in Sunstone because they thought it was good. But then a year or two later, when they had two empty vacancies in the department and neither of their candidates were accepted by the Board of Trustees, and they were told, well, we're basically punishing you for Sunstone, and so the people who didn't participate in Sunstone really got on the case of the faculty who did and said, you're just killing our department. We've got to be able to hire people and stuff like this. And so there were a lot of really hard institutional processes at BYU that made even most tenured people feel like that it just wasn't worth the hassle of speaking at Sunstone. And anyone who didn't have tenure, that was like death. And later, it really became part of the review process. You wouldn't even be given a slot at BYU if you'd spoken at Sunstone, or you really had to make a huge argument of why you should be hired. So BYU pretty well dried up. And also some mainstream Mormons. To do something at Sunstone, to cross the line and say I'll participate in Sunstone was always an affirmative act. But the emotional, social, theological, institutional threshold of doing it was pretty low, and it didn't require a huge step to do that. But afterwards, you were almost making a statement about who you are vis-a-vis the church, and so it was a huger wall to cross to do something with Sunstone. And for most people, it's just not worth even that internal emotional hassle, or maybe the hassle with your spouse or your job. Some people told me, who'd spoken years at Sunstone. I like Sunstone, I want it to continue. But I'm online to be a mission president in a year or two, and I don't want to ruin that chance. And I can't really blame them for making that kind of choice. But in the process, the breadth of the symposium narrowed, and the number of subscribers to the magazine narrowed, and the number of people who left who were angry at what was happening increased. And so you had the organizations like, what's the organization? The Levina.
The one about abuse?
Yeah, but organizational abuse. It's kind of like the ACLU for work. It'll come to me. Yeah. Shows you how far I've been from all of this sort of stuff. So they rose up and presented more and more papers. And so the discussion which had a defensive tone to it all, of defending our right to speak and defending this sort of, would come up. And those were hard times. We lost a lot of support. And in the end, the brethren won. They certainly achieved what they wanted. They knocked Sunstone off of a growth model. And I think perhaps this was inevitable in some way. Certainly the details of the September 6th, the people being called into the excommunications, which was in 93. I guess the Statement Symposium came in 91. 93, that was a hard time. That was the symposium again. And there, I don't think you had a whole joint statement, a decision from the brethren of what to do. I think you had primarily Elbert Peck deciding, well, they still haven't learned their lesson from the Statement on Symposia. But things started downhill after the Statement on Symposia. So we need to really show these people that there is a line, and some of them have crossed it. So they picked out those people. Some of them were for symposium things, some of them for articles that they had in the newspaper. Or quotes that they said in the newspaper. Some were just generally about their involvement. But one by one, person got called in for a court. And here again, see, the church is not happy with the independent voices, whether you're conservative or liberal, because Avraham Gileadi he was a personal friend of mine. And I'd had him speak at Sunstone on occasion, but he's not a Sunstone kind of person at all. He's a very conservative theologian. I personally don't agree with his theology. But he was slapped because they didn't like his very conservative interpretation of Isaiah. And
who were the others, and why were they? Who were the others September 6th, and why were they?
I think Lynn Whitesides, who'd been a chair of the symposium for years, I think it was for some statements she said about women in a Tribune article. Maxine Hanks, I don't know the particular thing, but she said many incendiary comments in the newspaper as well as at the symposium.
And her book on women in authority?
I don't think she was excommunicated for that book.
Okay.
That had been out for quite a while. But she was very, very much an advocate and almost an agitator, like in the Mormon Women's Forum and some other things. Margaret Toscano for her theology. Lavina for her chronicling of the organizational abuses of the church. Michael Quinn for his statements on the church, which were at the recent symposium. Oh, and that we published an article earlier about that same time by him in the magazine. What was that article about?
Post-Manifesto Polygamy?
No, that was early on. That was Dialogue.
Okay.
That was 10 years before that.
It was on spiritual gifts for women and that whole deal?
I can't remember what it was on.
Okay.
It was, but with Quinn, we published other articles. We published his article on baseball baptisms, which is a hard-hitting history of the church in England in the early 60s. And
Is magic and folk magic stuff?
Yeah, they'd been early, but the church didn't like that either, and they certainly didn't like his hierarchy books. And there are plenty of things by Michael Quinn that I'm sure. And by this time, they'd already forced him out of BYU, and they were just now telling him, "Enough is enough. We don't want you to have the imprimatur of being a believing member of the church. You can be a believing non-member, but." All those people who got their notices, and we heard about them one by one.
Paul.
Oh, of course, Paul Toscano, which his articles were often about power and the church, became increasingly strident and harsh about the brethren. So they all got their articles one by one, and that was a hell of a month. Lynn Whiteside's court was first, and we met. It was in the avenues, and we met at the chapel, and we're on the street, and we had all these candles that we'd put on this little retaining wall that got wax all over it, and we spent the night singing hymns, so someone would go in and out of the church to find out what was happening with her trial. Eventually she was disfellowshipped. Michael Quinn and Maxine Hanks chose not to go to their courts, so we didn't have vigils for them. Levina wasn't going to go to her court, but she scheduled a little faith service vigil, not at the time of her excommunication. It was at the White Chapel up across the street from the from the state capitol. They rented it, and we all went into that. And she had all these speakers, and we sang tons of hymns, and it was quite an electric evening, and highly charged, and very passionate. People sing. I've never heard people sing hymns with such gusto. And then Paul's court at his stake center in Holiday. There, the church by then had become more accommodating. They allowed us to run an extension cord out into the parking lot, and the court went on for the longest time. And there was an electronic piano there, and Ardeen Watts pounded out hymns while everyone sang them with gusto. And people would come and bring donuts, and it was kind of a fun, bittersweet, dark comedy of a night while we waited to hear. And eventually it took so long, people went home, and then they came back in the morning still waiting to hear the results of the Paul Toscano excommunication. But it ground everyone down. I mean, whoever thought you'd be standing holding vigils in church parking lots? And the singing of the hymns took a bittersweet tone on those nights. And, were we protesting the church, or were we just having solidarity with Michael Quinn, with Paul Toscano? It was a fuzzy line. I remember writing about the ambivalence in the magazine, and then getting this letter from Scott Card saying that he never could do anything for Sunstone anymore as long as excommunicates would speak at Sunstone like Levina. And he lamented that I was protesting my church in a parking lot. And then a few years after that, symposiums were very hard to recruit people for, and people became weary of Mormon studies a lot in the Sunstone group, and many of them probably already were on a journey that would eventually take them outside of Mormonism. That's a very common journey of intellectuals in any religious tradition, and this accelerated that journey for a lot of people. So a lot of the regulars no longer cared, and so you call them to even introduce people, and they go, "Oh, I'm tired of all this. I'm not going to the symposium." So you couldn't recruit new people to be in Sunstone. No, the wall threshold was now so high. New people just like, I don't want to do that, and the old regulars were either tired or weary, or many of the people were just protecting their jobs at BYU, or just not wanting to be part of it. And there were some who said, I think the brethren are right. I think this has gone too far, and they'd go back to more mainstream Mormonism. But all of those trajectories reduced the pool of people who were doing Sunstone. Those were very, very, very difficult years. And they were compounded by the fact that Sunstone's finances were again in the toilet. When Daniel left after his 5 years, when he left in 91 or something like that, he left shortly after the Statement on Symposia, or a year after that. Sunstone was flush and totally out of debt. Paid off all the debts we inherited from Peggy, which maybe were like $200,000 if you add them all up. It was a lot of money. Lots of them were a $5,000 debt here and a $10,000 debt here. And Daniel he was so incredible on the phone negotiating with people. We'd owe them $15,000, and he'd say, "Well, I can pay you $3,000 now, or you'll just have to wait, and you may have to wait forever." And he'd really bargain them down to almost nothing to pay off the debts. But we'd hired a publisher who wasn't really fit for the job. She was an incredibly wonderful person with great skills, but this wasn't her job. And after her year, we were back in debt, owing tons of money to the IRS again, and owing a bunch of other money. And so and when she left, we didn't have any money to hire a new publisher. So I ended up doing the one thing I said I'd never do when Peggy offered me the job. I was editor and publisher because we didn't have any money to hire anyone. And that was sort of the beginning of my emotional decline. I mean, I was energetic for those first few years. Worked myself hard to pay off the IRS debt, and then we discovered not only did we owe maybe $50,000 to the IRS, but she hadn't paid the hotel bill from the last symposium, and they wouldn't let us sign up for that. They wouldn't let us hold the symposium the next year until we paid off the old one, and I had to pay the next year's symposium in advance. So while I'm paying off the IRS, I have to pay 2 years of symposium, and I have no money. But I did have a Sunstone American Express card, so sometimes I would pay the IRS with the American Express card, which would hold me for a month, and then I'd have to raise $10,000 to pay it off for the next month, so then I could charge $10,000 more to the IRS, and eventually that little Ponzi game, switch and bait, to just hold everyone at bay for a year or two. I wasn't able to make my payment to American Express for a couple months. Eventually I did, and so they canceled our card, and I had this huge negative credit rating. And but we made it through, and so it was unfortunate that we were really in a tight ship when 1993 came around again, and that was, to have to dig ourselves out a second time was just very, very hard, and with so many people who would personally express me goodwill, but not be willing or able or want to do anything with Sunstone. That was very difficult.
Tell us about learning about Daniel's passing.
Well, once again, I was at a family beach trip in August in North Carolina, and once again,
about what year?
I had left Sunstone, so maybe it was 2002, or maybe the summer of 2001 or 2002. And so once again, Peggy Fletcher calls me for a quote for a news story, and she's the one who tells me Daniel has died. And that was very hard, because Daniel was such a force of life. He greeted whatever he greeted. It was with wholeheartedness and massive energy. And I remember biking with him once. I was kind of a lazy, casual biker, and he said, "Let's go on a bike trip once." And as Pat Bagley once said, Daniel's idea is fun. It's like going up a 90-degree wall on your bike. He was just energy, and he loved outdoors. He'd go skiing with his son and dog up Mill Creek Canyon every Sunday morning. That sort of became his church during the last few years of his life. And he loves to go mountain climbing and all sorts of outdoor activities. And he was doing, I guess, an activity that was a little too extreme for his ability, or a little foolhardy. He was climbing with a person up a cliff, as I understand it, that was very steep. This person who he was with was a very experienced climber, but who also liked to push things to the envelope. And Daniel was following him, and apparently that person just heard a uh-oh, and then that's all. Daniel fell and died in the fall off the cliff. He has a beautiful wife, Lisa, and they basically had two families. They had 2 children early on, and then they had 2 children. It was a decade in between the first group and the second group. That was very hard. I saw him, and we in the parking lot at the symposium just before he died, and we spoke for an hour and a half. I think it was 2002, just standing in the parking lot. It was really a great conversation, and then he was gone in a couple of weeks. That's how Daniel died. But he was living life to the fullest, or a little over the top, but a great guy. You'd hate him to dim his light and live a longer life so dim. But damn it, you wish you'd been just a little more careful.
So as you look back now, are you proud of your time at Sunstone? Or do you look back at it with joy? How do you feel upon reflection, both personally and for the church, about your contributions, yours and Daniel's contributions?
Personally, it was a great time. It was often very hard work and long hours, and lonely nights in dark rooms working at computers and stuff. But it was such a rich time. I'm kind of a little intellectual, and I'm I'm a generalist. And so Sunstone allowed me to dabble intellectually in all sorts of disciplines, from sociology to literature to history to anthropology, as you edit this and network with these people. And I met so many great people and so many rich friendships and just wonderful souls who really cared passionately about things. And I mean, what a great job. And I like a creative side, and the magazine allowed some creativity, and the pulling together of a magazine, and particularly a symposium, is not just a logistical and organizational task, but there's a creative side of who would be the best respondent to this paper, and you try to find just the right person from a different discipline who could put a different light on it. That's such a fun, creative thing, and you take the joy in the one miracle that happens when those two people do things, and you're really just the behind-the-scenes person. But that was great. I loved doing all that. I made great friends, and worked hard, and it was fun intellectually. My journey, my religious spiritual journey, while I was a lot more Mormon at the beginning than I am now, or was at the end, journeyed through that. And in that process, I sort of paralleled Sunstone altogether, which causes, I think, some of the tensions in Sunstone now. If you look at the Sunstone that Scott Kenny organized, and the people who were there at Scott Kenny's day, and even in the early Peggy days, they were all true believers from BYU. And they were looking, when they say they want to do arts, they want to have arts that celebrate and explore Mormonism, and history that celebrates and explore Mormon, and this sort of stuff. And those people at that time would have never considered publishing many things by excommunicated Mormons, or things that would undermine the faith. But they wanted critical studies. And the trajectory of all those people and all the many other people who joined in that path have come now, so you have a very diverse Sunstone. You have a Sunstone made up of people who are true believers and go to church and pay tithing and go to the temple, people who sort of believe but are not very active, and people who are cultural Mormons, and people who are post-Mormon or non-Mormon or ex-Mormons. And then you want to bring in the non-Mormon scholars. And it's such a diverse group. And, as Art Bassett once said in an article he wrote, how much tolerance can we tolerate? This is a much more diverse group. I came to see it, and I'm sure as all politics is personal, so all philosophy is. I came to see this as, Sunstone as an open forum, which I base that on the discussion of open forum in current American politics, which is you have a place where people come and talk, and you want honest discussions from everyone who's interested in this conversation, whether they be non-Mormon scholars or believing Mormons, this sort of stuff. And if they're civil and kind and respectful and want to pursue knowledge and stuff, then things can happen here. And I would make the argument that even a true believing Mormon believes that sort of space is healthy, even though they're making space for people who aren't believing or almost or are atheistic. And Eugene England really came to tag on that. Yes, that's what we want. And in the ideal, I think that's what Sunstone should be. I don't really think it's possible for one organization to be an open forum. Maybe it's possible for one country to be an open forum, but some people like the Nation magazine and others like the National Review, and they're going to go to ones they like. It's really hard to get those kind of people to talk together in the Eugene England ideal. And they're not going to like it, people, and they're going to be excommunicating each other within the larger national forum. And one organization can't do that all. And I experienced that dynamic all the time. There were, during the first half of my 15-year tenure at BYU, I went down to BYU every week, and like I did at 70s Press, and would roam the halls and drop in on faculty and just really immerse myself. And I became, I was surprised initially at how parochial even our best academics can be. People would say to me, that person over there in the English department, they don't understand things, and they're wrong when they write about that, and they're wrong about that, and they're really almost apostate. And we use such strong terms. And they'd say, but when it comes to this area, their area of discipline, the church is wrong and need to correct it. And so many people see, except for the area in which they think about carefully, everything else being okay in the church, which was a very interesting dynamic. Related to that is, everyone draws the line of appropriateness just on the other side of where they are. that card, that's fine, but this is off limits. It's sort of right where they are. So they have a hard time tolerating someone who they see is on the other side. And there's always that kind of finger pointing and judgment going on. Very few people who would embrace them all. I guess the people who were so embracing of different views became my heroes, the Eugene Englands and the Bonner Richies. They had a lot more tolerance for that. But organizations get their vitality and maintain their strength in life because a group of people are committed to what that organization is about, and they push it forward. And usually it's because they have a little cause aspect. And I didn't like seeing Sunstone of advocacy of certain causes. We'd allow advocates to speak within our forum, but the only thing Sunstone was an advocate for was an open, honest forum of civil discussion by responsible and thoughtful voices. And actually, there aren't that many people who are committed to that idea. It's such an abstract idea. Most people are committed to their hobby horse. And whether it be gay rights or feminist issues or even Mormon history or something like that. And it's a hard dynamic. And so I don't know where Sunstone's going to go with those issues in this new internet age. But
do you think, if you were to give your best pitch for a continuing need for a place like Sunstone, what would you say today?
I think it's a job of an editor. Well, there's two needs. Everyone craves community. And one of the things that Sunstone gives, particularly through the symposium and people attending the symposium, and now I guess through internet connections, is that connection with a person, with an individual. And you like being with them or you like talking to them online, and Sunstone helps provide that need. And that's an essential part of any sort of thing. But the other part is, I would say, I guess I use the word editor. And by that I mean there's a lot of words out there in this world. And I take the New Yorker magazine because I know that the editors have discriminating tastes, and they may not print everything I would want to read, but usually what they print is something that I would be comfortable reading because it's rigorous in its thought, or it's good fiction, or it's good poetry, or it's thoughtfulness. So the editor is the filter. And anyone who's tried to look up anything on Google knows the overwhelming task of saying, oh, there are 30 million pages about this topic. I just want something that's of quality. And if Sunstone, as good magazine editors do, becomes a filter so that that if I want to find something else, if I go to Sunstone, there's a filter. I don't just have someone's offhanded blog. I don't have something that's whatever is through the Sunstone imprimatur is filtered, and it's of quality of thought. And maybe if it's a controversial topic, it will provide me quality of thoughts. A plurality of different perspectives that are all thoughtful, that help me sort of see the thing from many different perspectives. And it's a shorthand. You go to Wikipedia, but you wince because you're not sure whether it's right or not. And which is why I wish Encyclopedia Britannica were online free, because they referee and judge. Sunstone in the internet age, I think, needs to be that kind of filter and editor. And so when you enter it, you enter a thoughtful conversation. I know that's hard to do because to make those things work, you want to be interactive, and and if you're being interactive, then you allow a lot of voices and comments, and you get a lot of dumb comments. But there must be a way to allow people to go to the quality and still allow the interactive conversation. But that's the role of an organization like Sunstone, as a filter as well as an access, and that points you to things that you want to find out.